The word Sherpa comes from the Tibetan word Sherpa, which means Easterner and is essentially used to describe the people from the eastern part of the country of Tibet. They were known for exceptional mountain climbing skills, and many have been recruited to guide and assist foreigners attempting to summit Mount Everest. So it's in that sense that the name has come to take on other meanings. And in the context of the G20 summit, the Sherpas are the officials of each country who lay the groundwork to take the discussions and agreements to the final summit. This is where the heads of state and government come in. They take the photo ops, they cut the ribbons, and the big decisions are announced. We are, of course, the next hosts in 2025, and that preparatory work has begun in earnest. And the person heading all of that, spearheading it for South Africa, is South Africa's G20 Sherpa, but also the Director General of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Zane Dangor. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. This is a big moment for South Africa.
Yeah, good morning. It is a big moment. It's the first time that the G20 is on African soil, and it's in South African soil. So we have a huge responsibility to ensure that it is a success, but also that we use the G20 to ensure that we deal with some of the issues, that we need to fix from an economic and social perspective, both in South Africa, but also on the continent. And as our president said, we also have to amplify the concerns of the global south generally.
Look, it comes at a time when we are in a phase of increasing global instability and uncertainty about what happens next really around the world.
Yes, it is. I think one of the international journalists remarked it looks like the 1970s without the good music and good movies.
And the good hair.
Because it is an age of uncertainty. We're seeing a lot more instability across the globe, whether it's in Europe, in Middle East, Africa, the Pacific area. So we are looking at managing not just how to address economic issues or social issues, but the underlying conflicts that drive them. So the G20 is going to have to look at how we make our voices heard on the geopolitical issues, but do so in a manner that we acknowledge the vast differences that are between us, because it's a very diverse group. We had a discussion with some G7 people, and we basically said, the G20 is in essence where the BRICS and the G7 meet. And we need to find ways of engaging so that we can work together to address the key challenges that we have to as the sort of leading economies globally.
Zane, is multilateralism dying?
No, I think multilateralism is under threat. I think multilateralism is facing challenges that it may not have experienced in the last, 30 years or so. It's an interesting space. I mentioned the 70s, but the last 30 years have been described, with the exception of the last 3, as the most peaceful in human history, which is an indictment on humanity. But the institutions of multilateralism played a major role in mediating much of the kinds of major conflicts. But we do see that we have, for the want of a better word, anti-establishment politicians coming into power. Normally politicians like this come into power through coups, but they're now coming into power through a democratic process. And this is putting multilateralism under threat because they actually have a mandate to dismantle institutions of global governments. Or they interpret that they have a mandate to do that.
I'm intrigued by that description of the last 30 years as being the most peaceful in human history. And I want to almost push back and say, tell that to the people of the DRC or people in Myanmar or Syria or Iraq.
Yeah. And, this is the thing. These conflicts have been there. And when this was put to me by some of the best analysts around, I was shocked as well. And that's why I said it's an indictment on human history. But then they point out to Vietnam, Cambodia, the First and Second World Wars. And then you got to see that there was a period within this last 30 years where, despite which region of the world you were in, there was a sense that there was a willingness to work together based on shared values, but now we're back into geopolitical blocks.
Yeah.
The Cold War has resurfaced, and this is why institutions like the G20, while they cannot replace the UN and should not seek to replace the UN, does play an important role as what we call a ginger group to influence the manner in which we champion multilateralism. South Africa and Brazil were particularly together with India in the last 3 years to reinforce the primacy of international law, much to the discomfort of some of the delegations. But we will continue to do that.
And it's a difficult task because, as we know, increasingly international law is rendered hollow because some think it does not apply to them. But let's move on to other things now. I said in my introduction, the heads of state show up for the photos and the cutting of the ribbons, but the real work of the summit, in a sense, begins now. You're pushing for the reform of the global financial system and its architecture?
Yes, we are. So this is part, even that reform agenda is also part of the Sustainable Development Goals. It has been championed by various G20 presidencies, including Italy. But, Indonesia, India, Brazil has really put it back on the agenda, and we will follow on from that. Brazil had a really good meeting of foreign ministers at the margins of the General Assembly with the reform of global governance institutions, including the reform of the institutions that govern financing and economic policy, including the MDBs, the banks, has really gained traction, and everybody seems to agree on it. The challenge is how do we implement it? So we want to build on the agreements that have been made and move it towards an implementation perspective during our presidency, because we're not sure whether there will still be an appetite after our presidency, because unless there's a change in the methods of work, which we will also be discussing, it may be another 16 years before a developing country or country from the South has the pen, or is the pen holder for the G20.
We'll talk about what comes after your presidency in just a moment. But Minister Lamola has echoed the objection of many African countries who say we're typically asked to pay more by these institutions, and that, of course, stymies our development, and then they blame us for lagging behind.
Yes. So, one of the issues, we talk about indebtedness, and, the statistics of indebtedness are really there for all of us to look at. There's about 44 countries who pay more on servicing debt than they do on healthcare, and there's another 18 who similarly will pay more on debt than they do on education. And it's a symptom not just of African countries, but many other, developing countries. So we want to look at what are the drivers of indebtedness, and it's going to be the cost of capital. It is the cost of capital, it's the cost of borrowing that is so skewed that it actually leads to further underdevelopment.
Yeah,
so
but that cost comes because of the risk.
I think risk is one element, right? And you got to look at what then underpins that risk, what underpins the conflict, what underpins the low growth. So when you look at the cost of capital in the broader context, it's not just about it's not saying like you're looking at individuals and the banks will be giving the richer, the middle classes lower interest rates than they give the poor because they're doing the sort of risk management perspective. In the global community, what happens is there's an underlying factor that gives rise to that risk, and this is what we need to address. The same elements that sharpens inequalities between states then benefits from this kind of risk profiling in the international community. And we want to actually put on the agenda that dealing with the cost of capital isn't just a technical issue, it's actually dealing with what drives the risk assessments, including the rating agencies.
What do you say to those who are concerned about the hefty price of us hosting such an event?
There's always going to be a price associated with hosting an event of this scale. But I do think that it does do two things for us. It profiles the country. It allows us to engage in the key economic and social policies at the global level that can make a difference to how our country is situated in the global economy, and the long-term returns will be seen. So I do think it's a cost that we should be incurring. And the interesting thing about our presidency is that we're partnering significantly with the private sector, and the private sector is willing to support many of our key events in an unprecedented way. I mean, yesterday we kicked off the Sherpa meetings in Sandton, hosted by Investec. Some of the other side meetings was hosted by Discovery, and none of them had asked anything about change of policy on and we think that this is a partnership that we should be driving more for the G20. Yeah.
In the context then of handing over the baton to a US, obviously going to be led by Donald Trump, some might argue that, I mean, I'm in the communications game, Zane, as you know, and the more somebody over-explains their position, the more they fail at doing so. There are those who would say, look, perhaps our primary focus diplomatically should rather be walking the tightrope of keeping our friends close and, dare I say, in inverted commas, our enemies even closer.
Yeah, so look, the US is part of the Troika. The US is participating in the Sherpa meeting. Unfortunately, the current Sherpa could not finally emerge. We know that he'll be exiting the system in January. So we're not sure who's going to replace him, but so far we're working quite well with the US. With the current administration, and they still have the reins. Share a lot of our concerns on indebtedness. Obviously, there may be differences on geopolitics, but we will have to manage whatever comes by the 1st of February. And I do think that it'll be a way. We don't have to do a major departure from our own policies.
Yeah.
Because of what's happening in another state.
But surely the saber rattling that's coming out of Washington now is concerning. I mean, I almost have to even ask you a question I wouldn't otherwise ask. Is Trump even going to come next year? Well, indications are that he said he would be coming. We'll have a better sense of that once he is sworn in as the president, and he actually, defines and outlines what his priorities are going to be. Then we'll have a better sense of if he's going to come. I think in the telephone call with our president, he indicated that he will be coming. But let's wait until the first 2 months of next year to have a better sense. All right, I'll indulge myself once more because I've got you on the line. I mentioned as we started this conversation the geopolitical instability and uncertainty of our world. What's our government's position on what's unfolding in Syria? Look, it's what our position is. The recognized government of Assad is now gone. And as I recognized by the UN, recognized by most in the world. What worries us is that there's a polyglot of actors, very diverse in what they want to achieve, that has been at the head of what is called the rebel groups. So we hope that this does not, create another Libya or another Afghanistan. There is a concern that the integrity of the state of Syria will not hold. That is a big concern for us because there's a sense that some actors want to bifurcate Syria, and that will be flying in the face of all the agreements that I've just said on you cannot not taking annexation of territory through the use of force, and there's no justification for that. We criticize it in Russia, we criticize it in Palestine, and that we shouldn't be, as you point, we could not have a situation where some international legal norms apply to some, but not to others. And this is what we will be watching the space in, and we're hoping that, given the fact that you have a multiplicity of players there, that we should be finding the way of convening some kind of discussion. The last time that we had a decent discussion on Syria and Libya was in 2018, really, at the Munich Security Conference. So I do think we really need to put this back on the agenda and find ways of ensuring that we don't have another Libya emerging out of this. Zane Dangor, I don't interview you often enough. The Director General of DIRCO there on the line.
Current events, developing stories, tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.